He's so old and weak. Look at him falling down. What a loser!
You laugh now, but one day you will be in my place.
Teenagers shoved a 90-year-old veteran into the street. 20 minutes later, the Marines surrounded them. When 5 teenagers pushed 90-year-old Marine veteran Walter Adams into traffic for their own amusement, they thought they were just having fun with a helpless old man. 20 minutes later, when Gunnery Sergeant Jackson and his Marines surrounded them, they learned that no Marine is ever truly alone, and some lessons are taught the hard way. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked sidewalks of downtown Riverside, California, where the summer heat seemed to amplify every tension in a city struggling with economic decline and generational divides. The old downtown district, once the proud heart of a thriving community, now bore the scars of urban decay, empty storefronts with soap-covered windows, graffiti-tagged walls, and the general atmosphere of a place that better days had forgotten. Walter Adams moved slowly along the sidewalk, his 90-year-old frame supported by a worn wooden cane that had belonged to his father before him. Despite his age, Walter maintained the erect posture of a man who had spent 4 years in the Pacific Theater during World War II, island hopping with the 1st Marine Division from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had seen humanity at both its worst and its finest, and his pale blue eyes still held the alert awareness of a man who had survived combat against determined enemies. The Marine Corps emblem on Walter's faded baseball cap was one of the few things about him that remained sharp and clear-polished weekly with the same devotion he had once shown to his rifle. His daily walk to the corner market was both exercise and pilgrimage, a way to maintain his independence, while honoring the routine that had kept him alive for 9 decades. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since he'd moved here with his late wife 40 years ago, but Walter refused to be driven from his home by fear or circumstance. At the corner of 5th and Main, a group of 5 teenagers had claimed the bus stop as their territory, their afternoon entertainment consisting of loud music, crude jokes, and the casual cruelty that bored young people sometimes inflicted on those they perceived as weak or different. Led by Marcus, a 17-year-old whose swagger masked deep insecurities about his own future, the group had been looking for trouble all afternoon, their energy and frustration seeking an outlet that would make them feel powerful. The teenagers represented a generation that had grown up without understanding the sacrifices made by men like Walter. To them, he was just another old man taking up space in their world, moving too slowly, representing a past they neither understood nor respected. They had no concept of the beaches Walter had stormed, the friends he had buried, or the freedom he had helped secure for them to waste on street corners. As Walter approached their corner, the stage was set for a confrontation that would teach everyone involved about respect, consequence, and the unbreakable bonds that connect Marines across generations and decades of service. Walter's daily routine had been the same for 15 years, ever since his beloved wife Margaret had passed away and left him alone in the house they had shared for 4 decades. The walk to Miller's Corner Market was exactly 6 blocks each way, a journey that took him 45 minutes at his careful pace, but provided essential exercise and human contact that kept him connected to the world beyond his empty house. The decision to maintain this routine wasn't just about groceries or exercise, it was about dignity and independence. Walter had watched too many of his fellow veterans surrender to age and infirmity, allowing themselves to be warehoused in facilities where their stories were forgotten and their service became just another line in a medical chart. He was determined to remain active and engaged for as long as his body would allow, even if it meant navigating an increasingly hostile urban environment. Walter's strategy for dealing with the changing neighborhood was rooted in his Marine training: maintain situational awareness, avoid unnecessary confrontations, but never show fear or weakness. He had noticed the group of teenagers who had claimed the bus stop corner, observed their behavior patterns, and adjusted his route accordingly when possible. But today, construction on his usual alternate path had forced him to take his original route directly past their gathering spot. The first signs of trouble came when Marcus spotted Walter approaching from 2 blocks away. "Check it out," he said to his friends, gesturing toward the elderly man with his cane. "Here comes Grandpa again. Bet we can make him take it the long way around." The suggestion was met with snickers and nods from the group, who were eager for any entertainment that would break the monotony of their afternoon. As Walter drew closer, the teenagers began their harassment campaign, with the casual cruelty that characterized their interactions with anyone they perceived as vulnerable. They spread out across the sidewalk, blocking his path, while pretending to be engaged in casual conversation. Their voices grew louder, their language more profane, designed to intimidate and humiliate. "Excuse me," Walter said politely when he reached the human barrier they had created. "I'd like to pass, please." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, but the teenagers interpreted his politeness as weakness rather than courtesy. Marcus stepped forward, his chest puffed out with the false bravado of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "This is our corner old man," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to attract attention from other pedestrians. "You want to pass, you're going to have to go around." The demand was both unreasonable and illegal, but it was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his youth and numbers gave him unlimited power over a solitary elderly man. Walter's response revealed both his military training and his fundamental decency. "Son," he said, his voice remaining calm despite the growing tension, "I'm just trying to get to the market. I don't want any trouble, but I'm not going to be intimidated by children who should know better." The word children hit Marcus like a slap, his friends snickering at what they perceived as disrespect from someone they considered powerless. The escalation that followed was swift and predictable. Marcus, humiliated by being called a child in front of his friends, decided to assert his dominance through physical intimidation. "Nobody calls me a child," he snarled, stepping closer to Walter until he was invading the elderly man's personal space. "Maybe you need to learn some respect for your betters." Walter stood his ground, his military bearing evident even in the face of multiple opponents half a century younger than himself. "Respect is earned, son," he said quietly, "and it's not earned by bullying elderly people on street corners." "Sono." The words were delivered without anger or fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous enemies than a group of bored teenage. The confrontation escalated when Marcus, feeling the pressure to maintain his leadership position in front of his friends, decided that words weren't enough to establish his dominance over the elderly veteran. "You think you're tough, old man?" he said, his voice rising with each word. "Let's see how tough you are when you're not hiding behind that cane." The threat was clear, and Walter recognized the signs of impending violence from his decades of experience reading dangerous situations. Walter's military training kicked in automatically as he assessed the tactical situation. 5 opponents, all young and presumably faster than him, positioned to block his retreat while leaving him exposed to attack from multiple directions. His cane provided some defensive capability, but against multiple attackers, his best strategy was de-escalation, and if that failed, creating enough noise to attract help from passers-by or law enforcement. "I don't want to fight you boys," Walter said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded Marines in combat. "I'm 90 years old and all I want is to buy groceries and go home. There's no honor in attacking an elderly man, and there's no benefit to any of you in this confrontation." His words were chosen carefully, appealing to whatever sense of decency might still exist in the group, while making it clear that he wasn't afraid. But Marcus had already committed to the confrontation, his pride and reputation among his friends requiring him to follow through on his threats. "Honor," he laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "What do you know about honor, old man? You're just another useless relic taking up space in our neighborhood." The insult revealed both his ignorance about Walter's service and his fundamental lack of understanding about the sacrifices made by previous generations. The physical assault began when Marcus shoved Walter backward, using both hands to push the elderly veteran toward the busy street behind him. Walter stumbled, his cane clattering to the sidewalk as he fought to maintain his balance. The other teenagers laughed and cheered their excitement, feeding off the violence and the sense of power that came from dominating someone they perceived as helpless. Walter managed to catch himself before falling completely, but the message was clear: the teenagers were willing to use physical violence against a 90-year-old man for their own entertainment. The realization that he was facing genuine danger, not just harassment, triggered responses that Walter hadn't needed since his combat days in the Pacific. His mind began calculating options, escape routes, and potential weapons, while his body prepared for the fight that seemed inevitable. The second shove was harder and more deliberate, sending Walter stumbling backward into the street where afternoon traffic was moving at dangerous speeds. Car horns blared as drivers swerved to avoid hitting the elderly man, their anger and fear adding to the chaos of the situation. Walter found himself in the middle of the road, vulnerable to both the teenagers who had attacked him and the vehicles that were now braking and swerving around him. Several witnesses began shouting at the teenagers, their outrage at the assault on an elderly man, finally overcoming their reluctance to get involved. "Leave him alone." "Ori," a woman called from across the street. "Someone call the police," another voice added. But the teenagers seemed energized rather than deterred by the attention, their adrenaline, and group dynamics pushing them toward even more aggressive behavior. Marcus followed Walter into the street, apparently intent on continuing the assault despite the obvious danger and the growing number of witnesses. "Not so tough now, are you?" he taunted, raising his hand as if to strike the elderly veteran who was still struggling to regain his footing among the stopped traffic. The scene had devolved from harassment to attempted assault, with Walter's life potentially in danger from both the teenagers and the traffic. But Walter Adams was not just any 90-year-old man. He was a Marine veteran who had survived 4 years of Pacific combat, and even at his advanced age, he retained both the mental toughness and the strategic thinking that had kept him alive through some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Instead of cowering or begging for mercy, Walter pulled out his cell phone and made a call that would change everything. "Riverside Marine Recruiting Station," he said when the call connected, his voice steady despite his circumstances. "This is Walter Adams, 1st Marine Division, World War II. I'm being assaulted by civilians at 5th and Main, and I need immediate assistance." The request was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone reporting enemy contact, and the response from the other end of the line was immediate and decisive. Within minutes, the situation would transform from a group of teenagers bullying an elderly man into a lesson about Marine Corps brotherhood that none of them would ever forget. The teenagers had no idea that they had just attacked a member of an organization that never abandons its own, regardless of age or circumstance. The crisis reached its peak when Marcus, emboldened by his friend's laughter and the apparent helplessness of his victim, decided to escalate the assault beyond simple pushing. "Maybe we should teach this old fool a real lesson," he said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone whose inhibitions had been completely overwhelmed by group dynamics and adrenaline. "Show him what happens when you disrespect us in our neighborhood." "Sir." Walter, still standing in the street with traffic backing up around him, recognized the signs of a situation spiraling completely out of control. The teenagers were no longer just harassing him for entertainment. They were working themselves up to serious violence, the kind that could result in permanent injury or death for a man his age. His combat experience told him that he had perhaps minutes before the situation became life-threatening. The other 4 teenagers, initially content to watch Marcus take the lead, began moving closer as their leader's aggression infected the entire group. Pack mentality was taking over, transforming what had started as casual bullying into something far more dangerous. Sarah, the only girl in the group, was recording everything on her phone, apparently viewing the assault as entertainment rather than a crime that could destroy all their futures. "Come on, Marcus," said Tyler, the youngest of the group at 15. "Let's just mess with him a little more and then let him go." But his suggestion for moderation was shouted down by the others, who were now fully committed to the violence and saw any backing down as weakness. The group dynamics that had started the confrontation were now driving it toward a conclusion that none of them had originally intended. Walter's phone call to the Marine Recruiting Station had been brief but effective. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson, a 20-year veteran who ran the local recruiting office, had immediately understood both the urgency of the situation and his obligation to respond. "Marines, we have a code red," he announced to the 4 recruiters and 2 poolies who were in the office. "One of our own is under attack. Full response now." The crisis deepened when Marcus grabbed Walter's cane, which had been lying on the sidewalk since the first shove. "You won't be needing this anymore, old man," he said, raising the wooden cane as if to strike Walter with his own mobility aid. The symbolism was particularly cruel, using the tool that allowed Walter to walk as a weapon against him, and it represented a level of callousness that shocked even some of the other teenagers. Walter, faced with the immediate threat of being beaten with his own cane, made a decision that drew on 7 decades of experience in handling dangerous situations. Instead of cowering or pleading, he straightened to his full height and looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded Marines in combat, "you have no idea what you're about to bring down on yourself. Sovereignty." The words were delivered with such quiet confidence that Marcus hesitated for a moment, some primitive survival instinct warning him that he might be making a terrible mistake. But the pressure from his friends and his own commitment to the violence pushed him forward. "Shut up, old man," he snarled, raising the cane higher. "Nobody's coming to save you." But even as Marcus spoke those words, the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed could be heard in the distance. The distinctive rumble of military vehicles moving with purpose cut through the afternoon traffic noise, growing louder with each passing second. Walter's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been satisfaction, while the teenagers remained oblivious to the approaching storm. The first sign that the situation was about to change dramatically came when Tyler, who had been watching the street, pointed toward the approaching convoy. "Guys," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain, "there are like 6 military trucks coming this way, and they're moving fast." The observation caused the entire group to turn and look, their confidence beginning to waver as they realized that Walter's phone call might have actually accomplished something. Marcus, still holding Walter's cane, but no longer focused on using it as a weapon, stared at the approaching vehicles with growing alarm. "So what?" he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's probably just a coincidence. Military guys drive around all the time." But even as he spoke, the vehicles were clearly heading directly toward their location, their speed and formation suggesting a deliberate response rather than a random patrol. Walter, despite his precarious position in the middle of the street, allowed himself a small smile. "Son," he said to Marcus, "you're about to learn something about the Marine Corps that they don't teach in school. We never leave our own behind, and we never forget how to handle bullies. To what do you want from?" The convoy of 6 military vehicles that rounded the corner onto 5th Street moved with the precision and purpose that only Marines could achieve under emergency conditions. Led by Gunnery Sergeant Jackson's command vehicle, the formation included 2 transport trucks filled with Marines from the local recruiting station, a logistics vehicle, and 3 personal vehicles belonging to off-duty Marines who had responded to Jackson's emergency call. The sight of the approaching convoy had an immediate effect on the dynamics of the confrontation. The teenagers, who had been so confident when facing a single elderly man, suddenly found themselves confronted with the reality that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. Marcus, still holding Walter's cane, began to understand that he might have made the worst mistake of his young life. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson emerged from the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped his presence, immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the area. At 42, Jackson carried himself with the bearing of someone who had earned his rank through 2 decades of exemplary service, including multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. His uniform was immaculate, his expression grim, and his eyes focused with laser intensity on the scene before him. "Secure the perimeter," Jackson ordered his Marines, who immediately began establishing a controlled area around the intersection. 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms took positions that effectively surrounded the teenagers while ensuring Walter's safety. Their movements were coordinated and professional, creating an overwhelming show of force that transformed the street corner from a crime scene into a military operation. The preparation for what would become a legendary moment in Marine Corps recruiting lore began when Jackson approached Walter first, his demeanor shifting from command authority to respectful concern. "Sir," he said, addressing Walter with the respect due a fellow Marine, "Gunnery Sergeant Jackson, United States Marine Corps. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" His voice carried genuine concern for a brother Marine who had served with honor decades before Jackson was even born. Walter, despite his ordeal, managed to stand straighter as he faced his fellow Marine. "Gunny," he said, using the familiar term of address, "Walter Adams, 1st Marine Division, Pacific Theater. I'm okay, but these young people seem to have forgotten their manners." His understatement was delivered with the dry humor that had sustained Marines through countless difficult situations. And Jackson's slight smile showed that he appreciated both the courage and the restraint his elder had shown. The climax began when Jackson turned his attention to the 5 teenagers, who were now completely surrounded by Marines and beginning to understand the magnitude of their situation. Marcus, still holding Walter's cane, found himself face to face with a gunnery sergeant whose presence seemed to fill the entire intersection. "Son," Jackson said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone accustomed to command in life or death situations, "I understand you've been harassing one of my Marines." The word Marines hit the teenagers like a physical blow. They had assumed Walter was just another elderly man, not understanding that his service connected him to an organization that never abandoned its own. Marcus's hand began to shake as he realized he was still holding the cane of a Marine veteran, while surrounded by active duty Marines who clearly took a dim view of his actions. We We didn't know he was military. Tyler stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of genuine authority. We were just messing around. We didn't mean anything serious. His attempt at minimizing their actions only served to highlight the cowardice that had driven them to target someone they perceived as helpless. Jackson's response was swift and educational. "Marines," he announced loudly enough for the growing crowd of spectators to hear, "I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Walter Adams, United States Marine Corps World War II veteran. This Marine stormed beaches in the Pacific, fought the Japanese Empire, and helped secure the freedom that allows these young people to waste their time on street corners instead of learning useful skills." The formal introduction transformed Walter from victim to hero in the eyes of the watching crowd, while simultaneously making the teenagers understand exactly who they had attacked. Several Marines stepped forward to shake Walter's hand, their respect and admiration obvious to everyone present. The contrast between the honor shown to Walter and the shame of the teenagers' actions couldn't have been more stark. The emotional peak of the confrontation came when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the Marines who had responded to Jackson's call, addressed the teenagers directly. "Do you understand what you've done here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had served alongside heroes like Walter in modern conflicts. "This man fought for your freedom before your grandparents were born. He earned the right to walk these streets in peace, and you attacked him for entertainment." Marcus, finally understanding the gravity of his actions, dropped Walter's cane and began to cry. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking with genuine remorse. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." The transformation from swaggering bully to frightened child was complete, and even his friends seemed to understand that their actions had crossed lines they hadn't even known existed. But Jackson wasn't finished with their education. "Sorry isn't enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 2 decades teaching young people about responsibility and consequence. "You're going to learn what it means to show respect to veterans, and you're going to learn it the Marine Corps way." What followed was not violence or revenge, but something far more effective, a comprehensive lesson in respect service and the consequences of bullying those who cannot defend themselves. The teenagers found themselves enrolled in an impromptu course on military history, veteran rights, and personal responsibility that would change their lives forever. The Marines had arrived not just to rescue Walter, but to transform his attackers into better human beings, proving once again that the Corps' mission extended far beyond combat operations to include the fundamental task of building character in America's youth. The transformation of Marcus and his friends from street bullies to community volunteers became one of the most remarkable redemption stories in Riverside's history. Under the supervision of Gunnery Sergeant Jackson and his Marines, the 5 teenagers began a year-long program of community service specifically focused on helping elderly veterans. Their first assignment was spending every afternoon for a month assisting Walter with his daily activities, learning firsthand about the sacrifices made by his generation. Marcus, who had been the ringleader of the assault, became Walter's most devoted helper and eventually his closest friend. The young man who had once threatened to beat Walter with his own cane now drove him to medical appointments, helped with household repairs, and listened to stories about the Pacific Theater that no history book could capture. The relationship that developed between the 90-year-old Marine veteran and the 17-year-old former bully became a powerful example of how understanding and mentorship could transform even the most troubled young people. The incident sparked a citywide initiative called Adopt a Veteran, which paired local teenagers with elderly veterans for ongoing support and companionship. The program, initially funded by donations from the Marine Corps community, eventually received federal grants and became a model for similar programs across the country. Within 2 years, over 200 teenagers were participating, providing everything from grocery shopping assistance to technology tutoring for veterans who wanted to stay connected with distant family members. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson's response to Walter's call became legendary within Marine Corps recruiting circles, used as an example of how the Corps' values extended beyond active duty to encompass all who had ever worn the uniform. The recruiting station saw a 300% increase in applications following media coverage of the incident, with many young people specifically citing their desire to be part of an organization that protected its own and stood up for what was right. Walter Adams, despite his age, became an unofficial spokesman for veteran rights and intergenerational understanding. His weekly visits to local schools, often accompanied by Marcus and the other former bullies, helped educate young people about military service and the importance of respecting their elders. The man who had been pushed into traffic for the amusement of bored teenagers became a bridge between generations, proving that wisdom, courage, and dignity could triumph over ignorance and cruelty when backed by the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood.